declaring a national emergency.
Breaking news, stay at home. That is the order tonight from 4 state governors as the coronavirus pandemic spreads. New York, California, Illinois, and Connecticut all ordering non-essential employees to stay home. Those orders cover 75 million people across the United States.
We will be denying entry to Canada to people who are not Canadian citizens or permanent residents.
In New York, thousands of people are self-quarantining at home after they may have come in contact with the coronavirus.
Fast to prepare for what the CDC has called an inevitable spread.
We are right now in a very active containment mode.
I remember how excited I was to be in my first year fully out of college. Friends were leaving out of our college town, finding jobs as we all applied and planned for what was next. I was saving up, working 2 jobs, bartending in preparation for moving to Los Angeles with my friend and pursuing music to like its fullest degree. After a while, the 2 jobs with an early commute and a less than kind boss started to whittle me down. The final straw was me getting sick and my boss refusing to let me go home. I quit and I took a solo trip to LA to see old friends and just experience the city in full. I never really had. I'd always gone to LA on trips as like a kid or with friends or for a school field trip, but never like independently by myself just to see the city. I returned and the world had changed in a way that we had never experienced. So by now, all of us know about it and most of us don't really want to talk about it and we kind of avoid it. But March of 2020, the pandemic began. Stay in your house and keep your distance from the world. My job went into a temporary shutdown and the world outside became so empty. Videos came out of an empty Times Square and I think that's really when it started to hit me. The whole world was on pause. I was in the interview process for a better paying job that was going to help me save more money for my move and let me work less at my bar that I really loved but didn't make enough at. The job called me to tell me that for now, they were on a hiring freeze. I kept trying with other companies as time went on, but received the same response each time. At this point, remote work was such a rarity that most places hadn't worked out how to interview and hire for the position to be remote. I spent more time locked away in my apartment and less outside. It started with playing games with friends and trying to get good at TikTok because a lot of my friends were telling me how important TikTok was for music and anything else that you wanted to pursue creatively. And it later shifted into spending more and more time working with protesters to organize and working on music. After about a month or so, my roommate moved out because she was becoming too depressed. I was sad about it, but I definitely understood. I mean, we were locked away from the world. This new life that was becoming normal was weird. It was full of moments of extreme isolation, and for most, that just wasn't enjoyable. Once my lease was up, I moved out because I couldn't get hired anywhere, and I ended up having to move back home with my mom. This is the story for a lot of people. Time would go on to pass, and I was just working on the things that I could, still pursuing music in this new way of having to, still isolating, birthdays passing, weddings happening. Life was happening, but it all seemed so quick and slow. By the time things started to get closer to being normal, I was 25, on the way to being 26, and I felt like I had missed so much of life. For a lot of people, they'll have a similar experience detailing their moments spent in quarantine and dealing with the vid. And I really resonate with a lot of people on these instances. Although I will say for me, being alone for such a vast amount of time taught me just how much I like being alone with myself and how much I enjoy my own company. So that part, I'm never really on the side with anybody on. It never really was that bad for me. But continuing on to today's topic, the pandemic skip. What is the pandemic skip? So down below, I want you to tell me, how do you feel like the pandemic affected you? In what ways do you feel like your life had changed? And what things do you feel like you missed out on the most? Looking back on things, would you feel like you missed out on the most? Comment down below, let me know. And without further ado, we're going to get into today's episode, the pandemic skip. So I've always personally had this notion that everyone is 2 years younger than their biological age, because something in me always felt like that made the most sense, especially after the pandemic. A few months ago, I came across a TikTok talking about an article describing the very phenomenon I had been dealing with.
The pandemic skip and what I think about it.
Have you heard about this thing they're penning, the pandemic skip?
No. You're 25, but you feel closer to 22, or you're 29 and you feel like you're about 26, or if you're in your early 30s, but you still feel like you're in your late 20s, you're experiencing something that's been going around social media, a psychological phenomenon called the pandemic skip.
I've seen a lot of videos of people talking about something called the pandemic skip.
Let's have a brief chat on the pandemic skip.
In Katie Schneider's article on The Cut, she describes how her life had been affected while missing her mid-20s due to the pandemic. She felt that key social moments had been missed. She was 30 now, but didn't feel like she was 30. She brought up that it felt as though we slept through 3 years of normal life. She mentioned her friend going from 57 to 60 and feeling like her clothes didn't match who she was anymore. Friends who refuse to acknowledge now that they're 32 and instead look to just getting back the time that they lost spending money on trips and clothes and food, and stating, perhaps when I'm 40, I'll become more financially responsible. She remarks on her sister's friend who experienced a similar timeline to my own, going from 23 to 27, stating she felt like she blinked and was now in the second half of her 20s. She ends the article with saying that maybe our reactions to the pandemic would have happened regardless, and that perhaps this is just what comes with aging. Personally, I think she may be onto something. There's a lot to be said about stress and its effects on the human brain, as well as repetition. For the first 2 years of the pandemic, life for many people was stressful. Even as things began to open up, getting people to participate in public activities was a challenge. Most people's lives fell into being on a constant loop, experiencing a similar day every day. I think these things had a major effect on the mind of those involved. The National Library of Medicine has a study on the impacts of the power of negative and positive episodic memories that I think brings more weight to this theory. I also think that, as simply as was stated, in many areas of life, milestones occur socially to allow you to acknowledge that you're getting older and things are changing. Yet for a lot of people, these milestones were missed. Now, I can acknowledge that this might be just a very purely American concept, because a lot of the social things that you would experience as you age that were listed in the article and that were mentioned are very much like moments that you really only ever experience in America, such as you turn 25 and after you turn 26, you're off your parents' health insurance. It's a scary moment for a lot of people, but the prep behind that is that you're spending those formative years trying to get somewhere into a job or a position that leans itself to allowing you to have your own health insurance. I think for a lot of people in my age range, I give a lot of benefit that a lot of the circumstances that they've experienced and a lot of the way that their life has been construed is a lot different. And a friend even asked me, which I'm glad the article mentions it, a friend even asked me how I felt about somebody older not really having those same social experiences to deal with. And I was like, I mean, I think they kind of do. I think that no matter what stage of life you're in, you're still in a stage of life. And perhaps the author is correct when she jokes about the idea that maybe we're just all afraid of our own mortality, because a lot of these instances are big moments when you turn 30, in the middle of your 20s, when you're turning 60, when you are getting closer to ages that really mark something. But I also think it holds a lot of truth that these points that people reach are very much like monikered in time for our society. When you hit 60, people start asking you about retirement. But before you hit 60, people also still ask you about retirement, but it's not as fresh on your mind. And if life is going by you fast and kind of like a blank slate, which for a lot of people, depending on who you ask, when you ask them about how they felt or what they remember from all the years that the pandemic was in its highest level of prevalence before the CDC removed it, even though COVID is still an active thing in our lives and people just kind of let their fear of it dwindle. When you ask people how the pandemic affected them or what they remember from their days, especially in lockdown, a lot of people will tell you about the random crafts that they did or how they quit a job or how they spent more time at work because work became remote or how they moved back home. Even for people with really good memories, the intricacies of what they experienced through time dwindles. And I just think that's something to think about. So what are the takeaways? Are we all just afraid of aging? So originally I rested on the idea that we really should give everyone around us a bit more grace. And that was the full conclusion I had. Everyone in my head is 2 years younger than their birth age mentally, is just sort of the thing that I had settled on. From videos on TikTok of girls detailing dating post pandemic and feeling like the guys they were dating were more behind than they should be, as well as teachers coming back into high school and having questions about the children that they were pushing through school. I say pushing, having questions about the children that they were supporting get help. And the teachers that worked in high schools that had this feeling that the students had missed key elements of their life. And because of it, they didn't really understand how to behave and how to come into high school the same way that other students had before them. I think with all of the information that I had viewed and gathered, I had settled upon the idea that perhaps, yeah, everybody is just 2 years younger mentally, and that's okay. And even with that being just the base conclusion, even with that being the last thing that I think about it, I do think it's okay. I think it is okay to just symbolize that maybe we all, as a whole, went through a really traumatic experience, and we have to give each other more grace in the aging process, in the maturing process, and understanding the values that we hold in life, understanding what we're pursuing and chasing our dreams and getting to these milestones at an age that we didn't necessarily think we were going to because we thought that we had more time and the time slipped away from us. And I also came to the conclusion that perhaps, yeah, maybe we're all just afraid of our own mortality. Maybe we really just don't like the concept of getting older. It is a harsh reality to watch as different pieces of what you remember in this world physically dissipate and change and transform. It is a harsh reality to watch as your own physical features change and morph in ways that you are unfamiliar with. It is a harsh reality to wake up, blink, and feel as though you have missed out on so many vital moments in your own life. I think that part of this is, yes, humans have always had a problem with mortality. It's not something that we cope well with. That's why we have so many stories of people chasing immortality. That's why we have so many concepts of people wanting to be remembered for their legacy. That's why we have so many instances of trying to make a mark in this world. I think people are definitely afraid of their own mortality. And yet, all in the same note, I do think that with something so traumatic as the pandemic and the things that transpired and the way that life was so aggressively shifted, trauma can be experienced in many different ways. And for some people, the pandemic made you older mentally because you kind of were just like, yeah, I guess I'll just have to settle this out and get all of my milestones done now. And for other people, re- it made you regress because you felt as if time was just starting to become a concept. If you were anything like me and you were sat in a building by yourself for months on end with the reoccurring theme of the same walls experienced and the same things experienced in the same scenes seen every single day, even though I was sat with myself trying to learn and pursue and transform and expand who I was as a person, it still can be considered, at least for me, a traumatic event. And maybe this whole video is just a video about mortality. Maybe the concepts that I'm speaking on aren't really about how the pandemic affected us. Even though I do justifiably believe that the pandemic did affect people in a way that we won't find out about for a while, probably until we're a lot older. But at the same time, I do have to have the understanding that humans are just afraid of their own mortality. Everybody is. Everybody has to come to grips with the fact that one day they may leave this earth, and it may be sooner or later. And I think a piece of what was so terrifying, what was so trauma inducing about the pandemic is that for the first time in a lot, and I mean a lot of Americans' lives, this is why I say that it may be a more American centric thing. For the first time in a lot of lives, for the first time in a lot of American lives, there was a threat, and not in a sense of like a threat far away, because America's always been at war since the time the country was founded. No, this was the first threat at home. This was the first constant and reoccurring threat at home. And I think that in itself made a lot of people sit with the idea that they might die. That's why so many people were afraid to go out as things started to open up. That's why things were so scarce and people behaved so erratically, because everybody has not come to terms with their own mortality. And so maybe that's the takeaway. Maybe the takeaway is that we have to become better about coming to terms with our own mortality. Maybe it's not that the pandemic was the worst thing to happen to us, but it was an important thing that we needed to see and needed to experience in like the mental aptitude way, not in the case of how many people passed away or now endure long COVID. That's not what we mean. I think that's something to think about. Humans, mortality, the pandemic, and why we want a legacy. As always, I'm a new channel. Like, subscribe, comment below. Let me know what your thoughts are. I would like to know you guys' thoughts, and I will see you guys next week.